women. And you can imagine we had great discussions in Geneva. Do we go and complain to the authorities? Do we make what is called the démarche diplomatique? Do they throw us out as a consequence? And if they throw us out, then you can no longer help the victims. Today, it's public knowledge. Today, you can denounce, you can do things. But in 1998, 1999, it was a dilemma. How do you protect the women and men who were raped? Well, you begin by assisting them, at least medical care, at least psychological support. But the biggest assistance you could give them would be protection, so that the rape would stop. Gerber talked about an incident in Haiti. You talked about the incident in Haiti, all right? Where you had helped a young fellow to get a blood transfusion, and then you sought him a couple of years later. But you also talked about what we call RFL, Relieving Family Links. Getting people who are separated after a natural disaster or war, getting them back together. And one of the biggest problems, of course, is what we call unaccompanied children. Now, you have movements of population, people run away from wars, and they get lost in the jungle and on the street. And when you have thousands of people, families get separated, children get separated. And during the fighting, I mean, I've had the same situation in hospitals. We have, national staff of the country who are living, and they're in the hospital, and there's bombing going on in the city. And when they finally go back out to their house, they find their house destroyed. Where are their family? They don't know. They've disappeared. They've gone somewhere. So reuniting families, returning family links, is a very important job, and it occurs also with refugee populations, and the ICRC works with national Red Cross societies, and every national Red Cross society, even your mile-high local branch here, have people who are specialized in the renewing of family links of the refugees that you have here in Denver. And that also we call protection. You're helping to protect the family simply by reuniting the family. And the hospital is a very good place to do that. In Dili, East Timor, after the referendum and when they had independence and the Indonesian army left, and also all the Indonesian hospital staff. So the hospital was empty, basically. The ICSR, we went in, we took over this hospital, the only referral hospital for East Timor. 6 general practitioners, 14 Timorese nurses, and that was it. We sent in something like 40, 50 expatriates. And then brought in more Timorese and trained them to be nurses and so forth, and more Timorese officers and nurses arrived. After 2 years, it was handed over to the Timorese authorities in newly independent Timor, to the Ministry of Health. But at the beginning, we had all of these wounded and sick people coming to the hospital, and people coming to look for their lost relatives, thinking maybe they were wounded or sick and therefore in the hospital. So the hospital very quickly became a point of social contact. And we put up an office for the Reunited Family Links, and people could come and register the names. I'm looking for this person and that person. Do you have a photograph? Do you have this, and so forth? And we put up posters. And the hospital then becomes a social center. After a while, you try to move that away because it then starts to impede the functioning of the hospital. But at the beginning, that's where people go. It's a place of reunion. Because the first thing you say is, well, is one of my beloved dead or wounded, well, let me go to the hospital and see if I can find them. Either they're in the morgue or maybe somebody knows. So here again, we have protection and assistance and a dialectical relationship between the two. In 1991, the dictatorship of Siad Barre fell in Somalia. And ever since, Somalia has not had a functioning government. The whole country is divided up into clan areas. And in 1992, there was fighting between North and South Mogadishu. Mogadishu was divided like Berlin, like Beirut, but that was east-west. Here it was north-south. And by a coincidence of geography, all of the hospitals were in Mogadishu South. But most of the doctors and nurses were in Mogadishu North. And they were different clans. So, with colleagues of the Somali Red Crescent, we opened up a hospital in Mogadishu North, 7 kilometers outside the city. It's about 4 miles. It was a former prison. And we converted a prison into a hospital. The cafeteria, which was large, about the size of, almost as large as this room, became the operating theater. 4 tables. We had 4 operations going on at the same time. One of the rooms that would hold 20 prisoners became an inpatient ward, put in 20 beds. I slept for 3 months in the cell for solitary confinement, which was about a meter and a half wide, a couple of meters long. They held a bed, so that became my bedroom. And I left after 3 months, and I was replaced by another team. I did something else, and I will talk about it a little later. That hospital continues to function today. It is the major surgical referral hospital for Somalia, a country without a functional government. Now in 2000, we helped to open up another, because the hospitals in Mogadishu South all closed. We helped to open up another hospital in Mogadishu South. So now you have 2 hospitals. But nonetheless, neither North or South Mogadishu is homogeneous when it comes to clans. And alliances change and shift, and people are kissing each other one day and then they're shooting each other the next. But Kayseni Hospital was recognized as being neutral territory. And years of what we call dissemination work about medical neutrality and don't shoot at the Red Cross or Red Crescent, etc., meant that even cars carrying wounded going to the hospital from an enemy clan would be allowed free passage through the checkpoints because they were going to the hospital and they benefited from the medical neutrality of the hospital. And in the hospital, you had wounded fellows lying next to each other that a short while before had been shooting at each other in the streets. And they were visited by the families in the same ward. And then those families would go back out into the streets and start shooting at each other. But the hospital benefited from, this became anchored in Somali culture. The hospital benefited from medical neutrality. Even the road towards the hospital, the wounded going to the hospital benefited from medical neutrality. So assistance, the hospital, and protection. Now that doesn't always happen everywhere. But in a country without a functional government, it has now become part of Somali culture. In Lebanon in 1982, there was the Israeli invasion. I was director of a hospital in the south. And I had to evacuate one hospital, and I went to Sidon, and then I went to Ein el-Helwi refugee camp. The city of Sidon fell to Israeli troops. and only the refugee camp remained. And many people left, and I was in the hospital facing the camp. I had a half dozen nurses with me and a couple of general practitioners, no anesthetist. That's when you learn how to use ketamine anesthesia. Give it by injection. Even if you're a stupid surgeon, you can learn how to use ketamine and give the anesthesia yourself and then operate. Now, at one point, the fighters came to me in the hospital, a few fighters left in the camp, and said, this night we're leaving, we're going to go up into the mountains and infiltrate it. Fine, so the next morning I find myself with 5,000 people, civilians, taking refuge in the hospital, a few thousand left in the camp. There's no more resistance. The place is surrounded by Israeli troops. And so we decide to withdraw from the hospital. Now the hospital had already been hit a couple of times, shell fire tanks and so forth. One shell cut the water pipes, and we had to drink dextrose 5% afterwards. It was more drinking water. So we gathered up the wounded and what we could, stretchers and so forth, and put them on the roofs of cars and what have you, and went down about 400 or 500 yards to the first Israeli lines. And we couldn't get all of them out, all of the wounded out at once. So we arrived at the Israeli lines, and we're wearing green operating theater clothes and so forth, and Israeli troops say, who are you? We're doctors and so forth. Where's your hospital? Oh, just over here on the main street, with the old Palestine Red Crescent hospital was. They said, well, then go there. Okay, thank you. So we've now crossed over lines, we're now under occupation, we go back to the PRCS hospital. We take the wounded, but we've left wounded behind in the Ein el-Helbi hospital. We did manage to evacuate them all. And in front of the hospital, we've got 4 Israeli tanks parked. And I go and I seek out one of the officers, who introduces himself as Dr. Danny. And I tell Dr. Danny, well, I've just come from the Ein el-Helbi hospital, this, that, and so forth, and we've, like, you've just come from Ein el-Helbi? Yes. What do you want? I want to go back to evacuate the rest of the wounded. Well, are you willing to go back and talk to the fighters and tell them, convince them to give themselves up? I said, there are no fighters left. They didn't tell them that they left last night, but I told them there are none left. They said, well, we see these people moving around in the windows of the hospital. I said, those are the civilians, there are 5,000. They've taken refuge in the hospital. He calls up his superiors, back and forth, etc., and he tells me, we'll call a ceasefire. You go back. And you bring out the wounded and talk to the fighters. I said, I'll go back and bring out the wounded, and if I see any fighters, I'll be sure to talk to them. There's a ceasefire. And I go back. And we pick up the rest of the wounded, etc., and we manage to get out. And Dr. Danny appears and says, did you talk to the fighters? I said, well, thank you for the opportunity to get the wounded out, but I didn't see any fighters. And he believed me. Now that night, Israeli troops brought prisoners who had been wounded, and they had, and civilians, that they had already given first aid to and operated and so forth, and they brought them to our hospital. They were respecting the Geneva Conventions. The rest of the PRCS team, and there were many, doctors, male nurses, laboratory technicians, ambulance drivers, etc., etc., little by little were being taken prisoner. Along with the male population of Sidon, they all went down to the beach where they walked in front of 3 jeeps, parked jeeps, and each one there was a fellow sitting with a hood over his head and slits for the eyes, and next to him an Israeli soldier, and as people walked in front of them, they were denounced or not, and if they were denounced, they were picked up and taken away. So, all of the PRCS team were picked up. I did not yet go down, and I had a delegate of the ICRC pass by the hospital. He came down from Beirut. how are you doing? Well, all right, we have the medicines. I said, I have a whole storeroom. I go, fine. But we have a problem. They're taking all the Red Crescent staff prisoner. Well, I have difficulties intervening with the Israelis because we want to bring in our surgical teams. I said, this is a Red Crescent team. I'll put them under your authority. I'll give you the keys to the warehouse with all of the medicines. Get the people out of prison. There are half dozen surgeons and tens of nurses, and we don't need the foreigners. I'm already a foreigner, but we don't need new people coming in. I'll see what I can do. He disappeared, I didn't see him again. Next day, I go down to the beach and I'm taken prisoner. Now, what I find out later is, in another city in the south, further south, Tyre, where there was another Red Crescent hospital, and there was an ICRC subdelegation on the beach. The hospital team went to the delegation, the office on the beach, and the Israeli army arrives. And the officer says to the ICRC delegate, I want these people. And the ICRC delegate says, Geneva Conventions. This is a medical team. They are protected, and they're under my protection. They talk, they negotiate, they discuss. Well, give them to me one by one. I just want to ask them a few questions. The ICRC delegate says, okay, I'll give you one, but before I give you another, you have to bring back the one. More negotiations. And finally, the Israeli officer says, okay, Geneva Conventions, you keep the people. And they were not taken prisoner. Same army, same war. One Israeli officer says, Geneva Conventions, okay. And in Sidon, the other Israeli officers were taking Red Crescent medical staff prisoner. You were terrorist doctors. Protection works sometimes, but not always. Same army, same war. Later on during that war, there was the massacre in Sabra and Shatila. And 3 years later, I found myself in Shatila. Sabra had fallen. Shatila was under siege by a Lebanese militia supported by the Syrians. Conflict between Yasser Arafat and Hafez al-Assad. Syrian leader, Palestinian leader. And Shatila was under siege. Shatila is about 200 yards by 200 yards. That's 2 football fields. 3,500 people. And I was there for 27 months. And during that time, we had several battles. 4 days, 20 days, 35 days, 6 months. And during the battle, the camp was shelled. Tank fire, artillery. Nothing got in, nothing got out. You didn't hear much about it. What about the siege of Aleppo and Homs, the old city of Homs today? Or the Yarmouk Palestinian refugee camp in Damascus? That's in the news. But it's the same situation. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. If you try to leave, there are snipers who will shoot at women, children, elderly. And you finish up all of your food supplies. Or they are buried under the rubble of the destroyed buildings. And after 6 months of siege, I'm not a very heavy fellow, but I was about 55 pounds lighter than I am now. And then there's a ceasefire, and the ICRC comes in with the Lebanese Red Cross to evacuate my wounded. Now, most of them didn't need further medical treatment, but I wanted to get them out in order to give the staff of the hospital a respite and some rest. And they would bring me in more supplies so that I could build up my stocks again, because we never knew if the fighting would recommence. But that siege the purposeful starving of a civilian population is also against international humanitarian law, against the laws of war. It's happening again today in Syria. I mentioned opening up the Kaysani hospital in Mogadishu, and then afterwards we set up something called the Flying Surgical Team, because there were wounded all over the country, not in great numbers, but in every clan region. And some places there was a nurse, some places a doctor, one place a neurosurgeon, trained neurosurgeon. But 95% of his wounded were amputees from landmines. And we visited him 3 or 4 times, and I mean, he was a trained surgeon, so he knows how to cut and knows how to sew. We trained him how to perform amputations. He didn't do too much neurosurgery, but he learned how to do amputations. So with an anesthesia nurse, and then OT nurse, and then a ward nurse, some people call it Giannou's flying surgical harem, we ran around the country, and if people did not have access to a hospital, we basically took the hospital to the wounded. Now, it's not very cost efficient, and it's not supposed to be. It's called protection. Combatant or civilian, you are wounded. You have the right to medical care. And protection of the medical act should not be based on a cost-benefit analysis. That's not what health is about. Health is a right. It is not a commodity to be bought and sold. And the medical act and the giving of that is a right. It is not a commodity to be bought and sold. And we set up another field surgical team in Darfur. Again, protection, taking the surgical team out into the desert, into the mountains, where there were the wounded. Now, it works if you have the ability to travel about and the permission to travel about, and it works if the number of wounded is limited. 10, 15, 20. Once you get 100 or 200, you need a hospital. It no longer works. But the idea behind it, of this medical act, of this assistance, the idea behind it is protection. During the second Intifada in the West Bank in 2000, the Israelis decreed curfews from time to time. And some of them would last days, 13 days, 17 days. And ICRC people would go around to the hospitals afterwards and find out what was happening. Now, the curfew was lifted some days for 2 hours. So people go out and get some food or something, but usually it was not long enough for people to get to the hospital. And staff could not go home because they were afraid. If they would go, the curfew would end, they couldn't get back to the hospital. The result, 3 hospitals in 2 major cities, after 2 weeks of curfew. In one city, 54%, and the other 80% of staff were not able to get to work, to get to the hospital. The decrease in attendance at the outpatient department, 97% and 100%. Nobody could get to the OPD. Emergency admissions decreased 79%. OT activity, theater operating activity, decreased 78%. Cesarean sections decreased 86%. Now, as I mentioned the other day, in North America and Europe, the major indication for a cesarean section is weekend vacation of the doctor. But in most of the world, it's medical. And therefore, only 5 to 7% of pregnancies end up in a cesarean section. So these are not elective cesareans. These are women who need a cesarean. They're bleeding, they're convulsing, they have problems, they have obstructed labor. So if the rate of cesarean sections decreases by 86%, what is happening to those women? They are dying at home. Hospital deliveries decreased by 88%, threatened abortions decreased by 60%. Patients on renal dialysis. They had 72 patients in these two cities. 32 were kept in the hospital. Because if they went home, maybe they would not be able to get back to the hospital. 12 managed to attend, usually because they went and lived with people, relatives or not, friends or not, next door to the hospital, so that they could get back to the hospital. And 28 of the 72, fate unknown. Now, how do you protect those people and how do you protect the medical act during the curfew? When even Red Cross cars were shot at. And that's the same army, it's not the same war, the same army that in 1982, the soldier in Tyre said, yes, Geneva Conventions, you can keep the medical team. And then there is the self-imposed curfew that the Palestinians impose on themselves without the fight. Here is a hospital that has angiographic services. Angiography is where you put injected dye into an artery in order to see the arteries and what's going on. Ministry of Public Health Hospital does not have an angiography. They transfer patients at public expense to Jordan to have an angiography done. 200 yards down the road, there is a private Palestinian hospital that has angiography and has financial difficulties through lack of patients. But they're two different political factions. One is Fatah and the other is Communist Party. That's a self-imposed curfew. That's called shooting yourself in the foot, if not the head. How do you protect access to healthcare when you have political sectarianism amongst the people that are under occupation? As Nader mentioned, in my personal professional career, one of my most important achievements, I think, is my participation in the campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines. Now, not every country has signed, but even non-signatories have changed their methods of combat. First of all, they don't give mines away anymore. It used to be the case. If you went to the United States, Soviet Union, France, Italy, etc., and you bought artillery pieces, F-16s, they would throw in 2 or 3 million landmines, bakshish. They were cheap, and they were given away as a gift. That's no longer done. They are not even sold any longer. They are not transferred any longer. And even countries that have not signed the treaty, including the United States, have basically stopped using them. The United States policy today basically says we will maintain the minefields on the Korean peninsula, the demilitarized zone, but we will not use them elsewhere. So the behavior of countries that have not even signed the treaty nonetheless has changed. And there are only a few countries in the world where they still have been used. Colombia, Sri Lanka during the fighting, Afghanistan, Iraq. But elsewhere, no, they've not been used. And that is tremendous importance. Now, while we were negotiating the ban on landmines, we also negotiated another protocol to the International Convention. And that's another great achievement. And that is the banning of blinding laser weapons. You didn't know that those existed. Well, before they were actually deployed in the field, we managed to have them banned. And the arguments for banning landmines, the arguments for banning blinding laser weapons, were medical and humanitarian arguments. But by doing so, we were protecting combatants and civilians. We were protecting the victims. And we used those arguments, and we also used the argument of bringing together 15 military who had used landmines or had been involved in wars with landmines, and they did a military study. So you had a Zimbabwean officer, who at the time was Giannou, and a South African Afrikaner apartheid regime. And they talked about the use of landmines on the border when guerrillas of the ANC were trying to infiltrate into South Africa from Zimbabwe. And basically it was, well, the landmines killed a lot of cows, but didn't stop too much guerrilla infiltration. Now, the minefield is supposed to be an obstacle. It's supposed to stop your enemy from crossing. What was efficient? The thorn trees. African thorn trees can grow 5-6 yards thick. And the thorns are very sharp and very dense. You cannot hack your way through. That stopped the infiltration of the guerrilla fighters, not the minefields. And so we had the military talk about the military usefulness or uselessness of anti-personnel landmines. Not anti-tank, anti-tank are useful, but anti-personnel landmines. And we use that plus the medical humanitarian argument. How many operations does a landmine amputee need? How many blood transfusions? How long they are in the hospital? What is the amputation rate? Disability, etc., etc., etc. We use that to convince sufficient number of countries and sufficient number of military in order to have the Ottawa Treaty signed and make a change. So protection and using the medical humanitarian arguments, assistance for a legal treaty. Now, some protection is not active. It's not because you do something. Some protection is passive. The simple presence of humanitarian actors, non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, the Red Cross, this, that, foreigners, the simple presence is enough to impede certain behavior. People get embarrassed. People, criminals often even get embarrassed. They will not do certain things if there are witnesses. But then there are others who say, well, if there are witnesses, let's get rid of them. And that, in my career over the last 30 years, has become a greater and greater problem. I opened a hospital in the village of Novyategi in Chechnya in 1996. And we found the village, and it happened to be the village where the Chechens and Russians were negotiating. Maskhadov, the Chechen leader at the time, military leader, and Lebedev, the Russian general chief of staff, negotiated ceasefire and the end of the fighting in the village of Novyategi. I thought, well, good, this is a neutral village. And perhaps this is the best place to put a hospital. So that wounded from both sides, all sides, different clans, different factions, everyone could come there. And 3 months later, I opened it as a surgeon, and then I was the medical coordinator. 3 months later, I left at 3 or 4 in the afternoon to go to the city of Nalchik, which was in a neighboring republic where the ICRC delegation was, to replace the head of delegation, who was going to spend a few weeks in Chechnya. And they woke me up at 3 o'clock in the morning. 5 nurses and the construction engineer were assassinated in the hospital residence. 1 bullet in the head. And so I had to withdraw the team. And the Red Cross, the ICRC, we had 85 expatriates spread across Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan. MSF had 2. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, had 8, and that was it. Those were all of the foreigners, expatriates in the area. And we didn't know whether, was it the Red Cross, the ICRC that was the target, or were we simply an easy target? And we were chosen by accident that day. Now, how do you protect people when the protectors become the victims? War is not good for your health, and it is a major risk factor. And if you do want to get involved on a policy level, administrative level, or on a level of healthcare or water sanitation, understand that you will not only be doing assistance, you will also be doing protection. And sometimes the protection is more important than the assistance, and that the two of them together have a dialectical relationship. It's not a dichotomy. And so the Center of Rights Development and this particular conference on the right